Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the first session of the COMA UK Virtual Conference 2020. It's a huge pleasure to be with you all, especially given the strained and changed circumstances that the Covid-19 pandemic has brought to us all. Much as we focus here on all that stems into and flows into transport, I do want to take just a moment to step back here and recognise the many human impacts of this virus. And I'm sure we all hope that the situation improves. For us at COMA UK and shared transport more generally, it has of course been a tumultuous year. I've been really heartened by the sector's response to the immediate onslaught of the virus, offering free and discounted rides to key workers across the country. At one and the same time, 2020 has delivered, I think, strong positives and worrying portents for the future. Walking and cycling rates have soared. There has also, however, been a worrying swing towards private car use. We've seen action taken up and down the land with new cycling infrastructure, low traffic neighbourhoods, continued investment in public transport, but also heavy constraints on its use, significant development on a national transport decarbonisation plan, the launch of multiple rental e-scooter trials, recognition of the potential of digital demand responsive transport. Further announcements are expected from this government before the end of the year. All of that is very positive, but I know I won't be the only one in feeling that there is so much more shared transport in the UK could be doing to fulfil its true potential. We're delighted to be joined in just a moment by the Minister for the Future of Transport, Rachel McLean MP. Minister, it's so good to have you with us and to have a supportive quote from you today, recognising that it is, and I do quote, vital that we embrace the potential of shared transport on our path to the green recovery. Well, we couldn't agree more, and we're delighted to be working with the department on a variety of things, including our annual car share research this year, playing a facilitative role with the department, authorities and operators on those e-scooter trials, and to have played a pivotal role in securing free ride packages in the Glasgow and Edinburgh bike share schemes this summer, while spreading the word and substance on how mobility hubs can help us on the journey to net zero by 2050. Just before I call the Minister to the stage, can I ask you to pop any questions that occur to you as she gives her keynote address into the chat box. We will have time for a short Q&A with her after her remarks, after which the Minister will leave us and we will move into our COVID-19 session. So, Minister, can I ask you to turn your video and audio on? There you are. Wonderful. And it's very good to see you, and we very much look forward to what you're going to say, as I know do the 131 attendees we've got right now. Over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to speak to you all today and to open this collaborative mobility conference. I really want to thank the organisers at COMA UK for inviting me to speak and for their excellent work to enable this conference to happen despite the current restrictions. It's really a great opportunity to come together and share knowledge about this fast-moving sector. And we've seen a lot of innovative and exciting responses to the challenge in the UK, from shared bicycles through to demand-responsive transport, and we're seeing growth across the sector, providing opportunities for people in all corners of the country to benefit from increased access to mobility services. This has been a difficult year for this industry, like all industries. It's been heavily impacted by COVID-19, affecting operators' innovation and transport users. But I know it's been difficult, but I've also been encouraged to see where the industry has stepped in to help the country during the crisis. For example, Zipcar offered discounts to key workers during the peak early this year, supporting over 3,000 NHS workers so far. A demand-responsive transport network, Go Coach, has also been launched in Kent, replacing 7 conventional buses to make sure key workers have been able to get to work during the pandemic. Shared mobility has an important role to play in 2 key areas of my portfolio, decarbonisation and the future of transport. And throughout 2020, we've been working on a new overarching transport decarbonisation plan. And this will set out the path that we'll take to deliver our net zero objectives together with our partners across the sector. This revolutionary cross-modal piece of work will pave the way to make everything from cars to container ships greener, helping local communities to shape their own local transport systems. Shared mobility has a vital role to play in tackling climate change and by ensuring a cleaner, greener transport system. We can also improve people's health, create better places to live and travel in, and drive clean economic growth. Turning to the future of transport, this programme aims to shape transport innovation and secure the best overall outcomes for the UK, creating a greener and more inclusive future transport system for us all. Shared mobility plays a key role in the future of transport. The Future of Mobility Urban Strategy, which was published in 2019, sets out a set of principles that guide our vision for the future transport system. Shared mobility is relevant to a number of these principles. It can help reduce congestion, support active modes as part of multimodal journeys, and promote mass transit through demand-responsive transport and by providing first and last mile options for those joining bus and train services. I am excited by the potential of innovation in the shared mobility sector to help meet the future mobility needs of rural communities too. New business models and digital advances could create more bespoke services which could transform mobility opportunities for people in rural areas. And I'm excited by the different examples we're seeing across the country of such services being trialled on the ground. We started trialling e-scooters in a number of towns and cities across the country, including Cambridge, Bristol, Liverpool, Tees Valley, and of course my own constituency of Redditch. These trials will allow us to gather evidence about the impacts of e-scooters on the environment, their safety concerns and potential changes to the type of transport they take. They will run for 12 months in total and will allow us to assess the impacts of introducing e-scooters in a real-world environment. Although we might be a bit behind other parts of the world, we have taken this time to develop trials that build on the experience of cities like Los Angeles and will generate comprehensive evidence on the impacts of e-scooters, which we believe will be world-leading. Car and ride-sharing have been with us for a long time, but we're seeing advances in how these services are provided. It would have been hard to imagine 10 years ago, when smartphones were introduced, that they would offer the functionality to book, pay and even open the door to a shared car. But this is a reality for many across the country now. It offers easy access to a greater range of mobility options for people. And I've been really interested in seeing the range of new ways that operators have been working with local authorities, such as Enterprise's relationship with Highlands Council, offering cleaner alternatives for members of staff to travel to undertake their work, while also offering car share to local communities. Not all journeys are long enough to acquire a car. This is why we have introduced ambitious plans for walking and cycling, and we've committed an unprecedented £2 billion worth of funding for active travel over the next 5 years. The 33 commitments were announced by the Prime Minister in his long-term vision for cycling and walking published in July. And that includes a commitment to establish a national e-bike support programme to boost the uptake of e-bikes. That could include loans, subsidies or other financial incentives using the learning from other schemes in the UK and overseas. And we're currently working with cycling and walking stakeholders to develop the programme, learning the lessons of previous pilot programmes and experiences in other countries. Finally, I know that demand-responsive transport is an area that's really captured everyone's interest in the last few years. And this year we have seen demand-responsive transport used by some as an innovative response to the challenges posed by Covid-19 and the need to socially distance. We've seen some really exciting trials taking place in places like Oxford and Leicester. Not all of these have worked or indeed will work, but it is this type of experimentation that will help us to understand how these services can be more viable in the future. And that's why we've asked for bids for DfT's £20 million Rural Mobility Fund, so that we can help operators, local authorities and tech developers run schemes which test these new approaches. The lessons we learn from these, together with the responses to the regulatory review, call for evidence, will help us develop the right structures for the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, shared mobility can drastically change the transport landscape of the UK and can help drive a green recovery. And I hope you're all as excited about the future of transport as I am. So please enjoy this conference over the next few days. Thank you very much for listening. And now I will hand back to Richard and open up the floor for questions.
Minister, thank you so much for that. It's great to hear the level of enthusiasm and also that range of examples. I think it's very heartening to hear about. But if I'm trying to speak on behalf of sectors here, it's also very heartening that the government's well aware of all that this is going on. Which I think hasn't always been the case. So, we are fired up by that. I wanted to start, if I might, with the evidence point. You mentioned the world-leading evidence that the e-scooter trials will gather in, and I think that is a fair assessment, certainly roughly speaking, and I think it's very exciting. What does that tell us lessons for other parts of shared transport, other transport more generally in gathering evidence? Do we feel you've got that same level of evidence across all the rest of shared transport, for example?
Well, I think a lot of these modes are very new and they are emerging. Certainly the approach we've taken with e-scooters is informing our thinking about how we go forward in this. When you're introducing a new mode of transport onto something like a road, there's a huge amount to consider. We have to consider the needs of all the road users and the people that are not using the roads or the e-scooters, but are nevertheless still impacted. And that's why we have taken what some would perhaps say is a slightly cautious approach, because we've seen things go wrong in other countries. What we believe with the trials that we're undertaking with the e-scooters now is because we've got such a wide spread of trials happening, we can use that to really develop a very detailed sense of what works and what works well. And we've already started work on the framework for that evaluation contract. And I think that really will help us sort of gather the data that's been collected in these trials, which is not happening in other parts of the world. But because we know that those techniques are available, that will definitely help us and inform us in the future when we're looking at some of the other modes of transport as well.
Super, thank you. I think that's encouraging. Good question in the chat box from Peter Warmington, which is, where do taxis fit into shared mobility?
Well, I think taxis are something that's part of the overall picture, and we already see a very thriving and vibrant taxi sector in this country. What we're trying to do here in my role in particular is look at what works well and look at expanding that. And I think if I think about the sort of rural aspect of the policy, and the rural strategy that we are working on, which complements the urban strategy, I can see taxis playing a role there in particular. They're not perhaps what people would always naturally think of as a first choice in a rural environment. But as people start to see more opportunities available and more different ways of travelling, they definitely could play a part in the overall picture. I think where we in government are very keen to step in and get involved is when we're looking at the early stages of different models that are new to market and not necessarily already commercially established. And that's where I think taxpayers' money should be used to stimulate new innovation.
Thank you. Question from Jonathan Hampson at VIA. Great that you are referencing digital demand responsive transport and the Rural Mobility Fund. The point he's making is that the delay in awarding that fund is creating what he calls paralysis in the market as authorities wait to act until they know if they will have this funding or not. So he's asking what could be done to accelerate the funding, getting it into the hands of authorities.
Yes, and you're right to highlight that there has been some delay in that process. I think people will understand that we're in the middle of focusing on a global pandemic, and not only does that take up time from people like me, it takes up time from obviously all my officials and also at local authority level as well. So we have had to, unfortunately, pause some very important work while we focused on, frankly, saving people's lives and keeping them safe. And that has unfortunately impacted on some of these really, really good and important projects. So we're now in a position where we have been able to pick up a lot of that work, and we are actually at the point where we can expect phase one winners to be selected by the end of this year. And at that point, officials will be able to start work with those projects that have been selected so that they can develop their plans and that they can receive their funding by the end of the financial year. So obviously I want to, convey my, if you like, apologies or, hopefully put that into context for people, that they will understand that it's still a priority, but with the overall priorities of the government have to be focused on public health at this time.
Understood, but thank you. That's good to have the clarity about end of the year. Martin Higgett asks, is an e-bike incentive scheme definitely going to be introduced? And if so, when?
We are we are looking at the e-bikes. I mean, I've just bought an e-bike myself, actually, to be honest, and I love it. I live in a very sort of hilly part of the country. Rural hills are beyond my cycling ability, but it has definitely opened my eyes to the potential of this. This work is ongoing, so we are working very carefully with a number of stakeholders, including people representing bicycle retailers and manufacturers. And we want to support a number of pilot e-bike schemes in the current financial year. And what we're going to do there is build up an evidence base to look at the type of approaches which are the most effective at increasing the take-up of e-bikes. So I think this is the first time that any government has actually delivered a national e-bike support scheme. So to ensure the best value for money, we think it's important that those conversations take place. And in addition, there's some work going on in the ongoing spending review, which probably most of the people on this call will be aware of how that works. Those discussions are still happening now. And that's when there'll be more clarity when that process is concluded about the funding pots for these various schemes.
Thank you. Let me abuse my position as chair just for a moment to say that shared e-bikes are, in our view, firmly part of the answer. Barbara asks a rural question, so saying that mobility is a particular issue for people living more rurally, rural services being cut, public transport reduced in many areas. Are there plans to trial particular schemes in these places to reduce car use in rural communities? There's a perception that you need a car to live there because services and amenities are not on your doorstep.
Yes, and that's a very good point, and that's at the heart of our rural mobility strategy. We do absolutely think that in rural areas, what we can do is look at innovative ways of that last mile, for example, connecting to interurban buses or other ways that sort of larger public transport links work. The Rural Mobility Fund, I think I talked about it earlier on in response to another question, and some of the work has unfortunately been paused, but we are, it's one of the priorities that I really want to accelerate as soon as we possibly can because of the points that the questioner made about the relative challenges of transport in rural areas where there isn't the frequency of public transport and car dependency is higher, and that has associated knock-on effects with air quality, pollution. It's interesting actually that some of the air quality issues that we see are not necessarily always in urban areas. They can be in more rural areas, such as, for example, Gloucester. And those areas where you've got sort of concentrations of build-up at particular points which contribute to poor air quality. So we do see this as all being linked, and that's why we want to have this holistic approach to the rural mobility transport challenge.
Yes, thank you. Building a little bit on that, question from Jolly, which is to ask what will be done in areas where roads are narrow and there is heavy car traffic. And they also want to highlight that low deprived areas are always last on the list. Would those areas be prioritised too?
So I'm not entirely clear about the actual question as in what will be done. But I think just if I can make a more general comment about, how important it is to consider the access of everybody to new innovations in transport. And I think that it's actually, I don't quite agree with the premise of the question that's been posed actually, because if you look at an area like a city, you've got a huge variety of deprivation levels in a very small area with a concentration of that, and yet you have a much greater access to public transport in those areas. So actually, if you look at the access to public transport that people would have in a deprived area, if that's in a city or a dense area, it would be much greater than in a rural area. But deprivation has many forms, and it's not as simple as rural versus urban. It can also apply to coastal communities and rural areas as well. So I agree with the question in that it's very important that when we look at new forms of transport, how do they reach as many people as possible? And particularly people who don't have access to high levels of income have less choice in how they move around, and they often have a greater need to travel around. They often can't work from home, They often can't afford to buy a new car or to access some of the new forms of technology. So these are vital questions. And I just want to reassure the person that's asked that question that is always at the heart of everything we consider, not just in this particular area of transport and shared transport and co-mobility, but in every form of transport, actually, that we do as a government. And that's when we're thinking about spending taxpayers' money and how do we support this broader agenda of levelling up. Is absolutely to answer the question that's been posed by your questioner there.
Thank you. Question from Ernan O'Farrell. What is the government doing to prevent the development of large housing estates in rural areas with no public transport links, thus making them heavily dependent upon private car ownership?
So that's a very broad question that's part of larger government thinking on planning. Certainly my colleagues in the local government planning department are highly concerned with this issue because, of course, it's important and it does link to transport. Because when we are thinking about where should we have new housing, there's always a need for new housing, of course, and if we don't have new housing, then it will be very difficult for younger people to find somewhere to live of an adequate standard. So we have to balance that need, but we also have to consider the impact on the environment. And the role that transport has in that is when we are looking at where do we build new infrastructure, whether it's roads or rail, we have to assess the impact on an area, including the environment, and also balancing that with people's need to access jobs, education and leisure opportunities. So it's a very broad ranging question, and I probably can't do it justice in the time on this conference call, but I do accept the point that's made. We absolutely do have to, when we're looking at planning, and we've seen a series of planning reforms that the government is interrogating at the moment, in terms of how do we get that balance right. We need to provide housing for people, but we also need to make sure that we do that in a way that is sustainable and actually helps us to protect our planet and our environment.
Thank you. I think that's heartening to hear, actually. Again, abusing my position for a second, but Como is taking part in this debate as best it can with MHCLG. I think it is an absolutely critical one. Question from Robin Winton at Go Travel Solutions. What is the timing for the transport decarbonisation plan to become a plan, i.e. turn into delivery?
Yes, that is definitely the top of the things that we're working on. It's a priority at the moment. So we are working through the spending review process at the moment. Obviously, the plan needs to have, as your question rightly says, policies that go with it. That needs to have investment. It needs to have government finance behind it to turn a lot of this into reality. We expect to publish that transport decarbonisation plan early in the new year.
Thank you. Apologies, I've just lost the question I was trying to fish out. Yes. Does the Minister have any thoughts on supporting local EV uptake in rural areas, particularly thinking of community scale schemes?
Yes, absolutely. So we recognise the importance of having EV infrastructure in all areas of the country. So we've provided a range of support for EV uptake, whether it's grants for people who are buying EVs, whether it's support through benefit in kind schemes, which are extremely generous actually for people buying company cars, or whether it's making money available to local authorities for them to make sure that the charging infrastructure is actually placed in the right place. And we've seen a number of local authorities taking advantage of that. We've doubled the funding pot that's available to local authorities from central government for them to install adequate charging infrastructure for their communities. So what I would say to anybody that thinks that they don't have enough in their local area, because we know that not all councils actually have taken up that offer. So please bang on the door of your local council, find out if they've accessed that funding, and if not, ask them why not, because the money's there on the table.
Thank you. I should make this last question conscious of your deadline, Minister. What is the Minister doing to encourage co-mobility hubs that comprise multiple zero-emission transport modes?
So I think this is a brilliant vision, and in my capacity as a minister here, this is all part of what we're doing in the future of transport. So you will see a lot of this coming out in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, because we are accelerating work around, especially around sort of zero emission freight. I'm not sure if the question is referring to that, but what we know at the moment is we're seeing an awful lot of sort of van deliveries, last mile deliveries, etc., while people are working from home in particular. And what we want to do is transition that to zero emission deliveries. So the idea is you could have an out of town hub where you sort of things come en masse, and then beyond that it can be delivered to people's homes in a zero emission manner. And we are investing now, switching investment to trialling this technology at scale. And I'm optimistic that you will definitely hear a lot more about this soon from myself and from the Prime Minister as well.
Thank you. That's encouraging. Mobility hubs of that kind, certainly including a role for logistics, are part of what we've been working on, as you know, Minister, so that's very encouraging. I'd like to thank you very much for being here, for all that you've contributed, for taking so many questions in the time you have. It is much appreciated, and we look forward to lots of future events with you, lots of engagement with your department.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and have a lovely conference, everybody.
Thank you very much, Minister. All the best. Now, everybody, there will be a short pause, but hopefully very short, while we welcome the speakers for our next session onto the stage. And while that is happening, I can run through a little bit of the housekeeping. Thank you all very much for the questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to ask all of them, but I hope I did a reasonable job. We will be scanning the chat boxes of every session in this conference and scooping out key points into the cafe space. And I will just pop details of that onto your screens now. So this is the parallel directory, networking, content sharing, chat arranging space that runs alongside this conference, runs the whole of this week. Do take a look, do participate and contribute. You can set up one-to-one Zoom calls in there. There are chat threads across the different shared transport modes, and generally, hopefully, lots of interesting things. I will pop this up at the end of the session as well. So as we go through these next presentations, please be popping questions into the chat. Speakers, feel free to put your video audio on now. Certainly John to join me first. Oh, there. And as we go through, pop those questions in. We'll then have a panel debate amongst the speakers, and we will open out to wider Q&A, which we've left lots of time for. And I think it will be very good and lively. We do have slides for all the speakers apart from John Sorrow, who I can see is joining me on the screen now. So I will set the screen correctly, which I've now managed. John Sorrow, Director of Economics at Jacobs. We are very much looking forward to a scene set here from you relating to COVID, transport and beyond. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. So I just wanted to set the scene as to what's been happening in terms of travel and mobility in this pandemic. And I think it's useful to go back to the reasons why we travel in the first place. And three major reasons why we travel are to do with work, with leisure, and with retail. And all those activities were changing pre-COVID, and COVID has effectively accelerated some of those changes that's been going on. So you probably all recall way back in now 2019, it seems like a different generation, a different century ago almost, that we saw lots of news stories about the retail sector being in trouble. A lot of retail chains were closing down, and that's because of online shopping. And in fact, retail, bricks and mortar retail, the stuff you buy from your shop, the level of sales is still below that last seen in 2008. So we're seeing a decline in traditional retail space, and that has accelerated dramatically as a result of COVID and the huge boom in online deliveries that we've been seeing. At the same time, on the leisure sector, we've also been seeing major changes, which are perhaps slightly more subtle. So cinema takings, for example, box office takings in our cinemas peaked 10 years ago and are now half the level they were then. Netflix and other streaming apps have come along and taken off that market share. And again, think back to 2019, and we're seeing news stories about the closure of restaurant chains. We've seen major chains in sort of casual dining, as it's called, closing down. And again, with COVID-19, we've seen a massive increase in the uptake of home food deliveries. Just Eat, which claims about half the market share, delivered over 120 million meals to households in the first 3 quarters of this year. Roughly, if you take the whole market as a whole, about the average household is taking about 6 home delivery meals every quarter. And that's activity that otherwise would have taken place in our high streets, in our town centres. And then, as you can see from the background, I'm one of the many millions of people working from home. Again, it's accelerating a trend that has been in existence for some time. On a Friday, around 10% fewer people commute to work back in 2019 than they did on a Monday to Thursday. A major change that had been occurring in our travel patterns. And work we've done for the rail delivery group suggests that up to 40% of rail commuters will there'll be a reduction of about 40% in rail commuting as a result of COVID-19 as people work more from home going forward. And that has big implications on our city centres and the jobs that occur in city centres. Some work done by the Centre for Cities a few years ago showed that on a typical Friday evening in our major cities, the examples they showed were Sheffield and Manchester, about 30% of those people who were working in those cities were still in the city centre around 10 o'clock at night. They were using the leisure facilities available, the pubs, the clubs, the restaurants, theatres, cinemas, etc. And as people work less within city centres, then there's less jobs and opportunities within those city centres. So we've seen major changes in mobility as a result of trends that were already occurring and as a result of COVID-19. And what we've also seen, as has already been alluded to in the previous session, is a massive reduction in the use of public transport. The amount of usage of buses before the present national lockdown in England was around 40% low. It was 40% lower than normal, and for rail use, it's around 70% less than normal. So what we're seeing is a major change occurring. We're moving from a system of mass transit, which was, I wouldn't say booming, certainly rail use had been increasing over a period of time, but had been declining. But we see a move from that mass transit to personal transit. And the point was made earlier on that we've seen a boom in walking and cycling. Well, the figures don't quite bear that out. What we've seen is a massive increase in cycling that took place during the first UK-wide lockdown, but that hasn't been taken forward. What has happened is we've seen an increase in leisure cycling, but less so cycling for other purposes, whether it's at work, shopping, etc. We have seen a big increase in bike hire schemes taking off, so a lot of increase in the use of those. But again, the cycling revolution that people are hoping for is still not fully materialized, and it's still got some way to go. Walking, on the other hand, we've seen a massive fall in the level of walking being taking place. If we take city centres, especially where the footfall counters are based, a large reduction, and that's linked in to the fact that we're seeing large reductions in people shopping within our town centres. And the other trend that was happening pre-COVID, which is an issue which is a bit debatable about how it's going now, is the whole use of ride apps. We don't have much data in the UK in the use of ride apps, but it's interesting that in New York, over the last 4 years, the increase in the use of rides on ride apps such as Uber and Lyft, the increase of those actually matches the decrease in patronage on the subway and bus network in New York. And that has resulted in increased congestion. We've seen that in a number of cities around the UK, large numbers of cars waiting for hire, increased number of vehicles on the roads, and New York is following London in actually moving towards congestion charging to address these sorts of issues. So we've seen these trends occurring, a move from mass transit to local transit. And the question is, how far is that going to go in the future? How have we changed our trips? And again, a question was raised about rural areas. There's lots of talk now going on about 15-minute neighborhoods. 15-minute neighborhoods may be fine if you're like me, living in a very dense urban area. There are lots of shops close by that I can walk to, but that's not the case in many parts of the country. And as I said, we've seen this closure of a lot of smaller retailers. We've seen closure in lots of restaurants. And that's meant that people who want to go shopping, want to go out for leisure purposes, are having to travel further. And often because those journeys are made in not into sort of city centres where there are chances to share mobility more, but more we're now moving suburb to suburb where there are less opportunities to share transport. There's a question mark about, again, this idea of, is shared transport going to be the way forward that we were expecting it to be pre-COVID? So lots of questions, relatively few answers. I'm going to leave it there as giving you that overarching overview and hand back to your chair, and it'll be interesting to see how the other speakers deal with these sorts of issues. So over to you, Richard.
John, thank you. That was very interesting. I thought it would be. Mass transit to local transit is a very nice way of putting it. I think that sums up a lot for me. That 40% reduction figure is very startling in rail commuting, isn't it? These are profound impacts. So to flesh these impacts out more, could I call David Watts to the stage, please? Thank you, David. Let's get the slide deck going.
Wonderful.
Hopefully you can see that.
All good?
Great. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all. Really good to be with you this morning. Delighted to be here. Really just wanted to try and, I suppose, move that conversation on in terms of thinking about design response as a designer. What role do we have to play in how this change is impacting everyone? And I guess really the focus then is about, we've seen some of the short-term changes, but what's sticky, what's the longer term impact, and how are things going to change? As we talked about already, one of the strongest drivers that we've got is this change in the way in which we work, and working from home, which most of us probably on this session today are at home today, and how those travel patterns that John talked about have changed, and the nature of particularly peak travel in public transport with the lack of commuting going on. So that's really I think a fascinating change in the way it's changing both our transport use, but also the way in which our cities and living areas are functioning. And as has already been mentioned by the Minister earlier, this kind of slightly worrying trend, I suppose, back to car usage and all the things that come with that, is, we're interested in how this is a moment of change, and what this might do to things, and how we use all the different things that we have at our disposal to drive that change forward. I think now is the moment at which that becomes really interesting. And I think probably one of the main things then that comes through for me is that kind of rise of localism. Major city centres are changing rapidly. And those kind of local centres in our suburbs, our towns and villages, where people are actually spending more of their lives now, is a really interesting change. Certainly the estate agents seem to be very interested in how we're all, lots of people are leaving the city centre and creating that kind of search for more space. So if we are moving and our kind of behaviours and our individual needs are changing with this kind of, perhaps for many of us, a more kind of hybrid situation where we're spending more time at home in our towns, in our suburbs, and less time in the city centre, that creates the question about what does that do for mobility and transport, and clearly has a massive impact on mass transit, as has already been mentioned. But it starts to challenge all of those different things around kind of service models, ticketing structures, all the different components that are in there that sit across our transport system, are going to have to adapt. And that kind of local solution, I guess when we're talking about particularly things like last mile, I think are things where it's going to be really interesting to focus. And we've talked a little bit about cycling and walking and e-scooters and the role that they have in terms of connecting up. And I think that's the main thing for me is about what is the design challenge in terms of connecting up and designing things that work in a local context, local situation. How do we bring local communities into that conversation to look at the range of different options and how they're going to work with that really wide range of individual needs. And I think those kind of inclusive design principles that we certainly talk a lot about in our work are really fundamental. How do we look at that broad range of individuals across society and make these solutions work and integrate across the system? And I think that kind of system thinking as a designer, I think is really at the heart of a lot of the questions at the moment. So there's a lot of conversations about, very interesting to hear the Minister this morning talking about public policy and the governmental leaders. And to make this work, there needs to be a lot of really good design that starts to look at all the different parts of that system and how they're going to work for people. But that real challenge is about how do all those different bits connect and join up. What we do as individuals is we take journeys. Those journeys cover different modes, have a myriad of different needs, and the response to figure out how all these different bits work into people's daily lives and those journeys is complex. Our world is fragmented with service providers, public and private bodies owning different parts of the system. So there's a real challenge there, and I suppose you kind of see that a little bit in some of the trials that go on. So there's been quite a lot in the press recently about closing city streets, creating a bit more of a kind of haven for pedestrians and cyclists. But whether that is just shifting the problem elsewhere in the city and increasing congestion elsewhere is an interesting question. So that kind of integrated thinking about how interventions in one part of the system impact others and they join up, I think is the challenge. So that's really, as a designer, where I'm interested in is that kind of integrated thinking. So just a few, I suppose, provocations maybe for people to think about as they listen to the rest of the sessions across this conference, which I think is going to be a really interesting few days. Firstly, about how do we capture and really understand some of those individual needs, and how do we create the right structures to co-create solutions across our communities. When we're thinking about designing some of those interventions, how do we think across and integrate across the physical, the digital and service, and how do we bring those together? And who is going to own this kind of system level design in the kind of fragmented world that we live in, I think is a major challenge. So 3 things perhaps to think about as you listen to the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That's fantastic. So we've had the economics and data scene set, we've had the design perspective, and now let us move on to the behavioural one. Matt Higgins from Steer. Matt, over to you.
Hi everyone, great to be here. My name is Matt Higgins. I'm a senior consultant at Steer, and I've done research into behavioural economics and its potential applicability to active travel schemes and other behavioural schemes and mobility schemes. So I first got interested in this doing my MSc dissertation. I've had subsequently my research has been published, and I've been writing articles trying to pick out some of the key lessons for practitioners, one of which was in local transport today, which Richard from Como UK saw, and which is why he asked me to speak today. So what is behavioural economics? Well, it draws on psychology and behavioural sciences to acknowledge that we are human and we're sociable, emotional, and sometimes make decisions that are perhaps not in our best interests in the long run. And I think the relevance really is that a lot of behavior change is kind of the way it's delivered is based on kind of rational choice theory, expecting that people are going to look at some information and make really logical, perfect decisions, when in actual fact, you know, these human elements of who we are really drive our behavior and decision making. And actually, you know, we think much less than we think. Most of our behavior is automatic. So you've probably seen this in kind of theory. But yeah, it kind of very reflecting takes a lot of cognitive processing, which is we're not computers that make purely kind of rational decisions. So why is this important? Well, as kind of behavior change and active travel and other scheme promoters, I think it's really important that we kind of understand all facets of human behavior and decision making. Mini Holland scheme.
Matt, apologies. Sorry, Richard, to pop in. Yes, we keep losing you. Perhaps try turning your video off.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Video off. I'm sure everyone will agree that's better anyway. So I studied the Walthamstow Village Mini Holland scheme, and which, you know, had some key opposition to it. Local residents carried a coffin down the high street to symbolise the death of the high street. There were protests, and I guess the point is all of this is human behaviour. You know, that was a while ago. Looking at kind of some of the COVID-19 schemes, we're seeing it again with the Emergency Active Travel Fund, opposition to schemes. You know, a lot of them are not going down particularly well, and kind of these are delivered through human behaviour and reacted to through human behaviour as well. And in terms of, you've probably seen these pictures before, but in terms of kind of mobility solutions, again, all driven by human behaviour. Where do people dispose of scooters and bikes? How should people behave in heavily pedestrianised areas? And you can see these two ladies in the bottom right are clearly not getting on very well with sharing their vehicle. So all of it is kind of driven by human behaviour. So how do we use this knowledge? So for my research, I studied opposition to the Walthamstow Village scheme and tried to boil down the key reasons that seem to be why people were opposed to it in terms of from the nature of the scheme and communications about the scheme. And I use this framework called Mindspace. Other frameworks are available. Probably most widely used now is the EAST framework, which is essentially a condensed version of this. But it pulls out some of the key principles of human behavior, the influences that drive our behavior. And I cross-referenced the opposition to the scheme against this framework, and I found multiple connections between them, which made me conclude that, you know, some of these key principles were driving behavior that was seen in this scheme, and that perhaps by considering these principles when designing a scheme, we might be able to, you know, reach more optimal outputs, perhaps avoiding inadvertently triggering behaviors that we don't want, and perhaps using some of this knowledge to kind of influence behavior that we do want to get want to see. So I've pulled out 5 top behavioral insights for scheme promoters. The first of which is that the first information people see is the most important. This is known as anchoring. So essentially, you need to get the first information or communication right, because that will be subsequently people will judge that information against what they're seeing now, which has led to opposition in many of these schemes as things change over time. Social norms are really, really influential. So what is seen as normal is a key influence on our behavior because we want to fit in. Loss aversion, we hate losing something twice as much as we like gaining something. In our professions, we probably talk about the benefits of schemes quite regularly, but actually thinking about what we actually lose by not doing these schemes might be a more powerful way to communicate and deliver schemes. We also, this automatic behavior, we will normally take the option that requires doing nothing. So setting out, well, what happens if nothing is done? Because we don't like to actually have to use our brains, and whether that's ticking or unticking a box. And also kind of the reason the news is dominated by negative stories and peak dramatic stories is because that's what really sticks in our memory and gets us tuning in or reading the paper. So perhaps trying to avoid those types of incidents will help to promote schemes. This is an old version of a slide deck by the looks of it. I've taken some of the images have been taken out. But essentially, I've seen various uses of things like social norms in promotion of some mobility, shared mobility schemes, which I think is really effective. I think normally you see kind of a lonely bike or a lonely cyclist or an empty scooter or one person on a scooter being used to promote. And I think especially in terms of social norms, is that showing that this is a normal behavior? Whereas sometimes you see images where it's a group of people cycling or using a scooter. And just thinking about social norms, for example, that always sits as a more powerful image to me. But yeah, so just to finish off, I'd be really interested to hear, what people think about behavioral economics and its potential applicability in delivering mobility schemes and in responding to the challenges of COVID-19.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. Apologies all for the connection issues. That's super interesting stuff. I think, I hope it will generate lots of questions in the chat box. Do please use that. And that is a first for a Coma UK conference, I believe, in featuring Homer Simpson, but perhaps not the last. Can I call Alan Chancer from Move It to the stage, please? Alan.
Hi, everybody. So thank you very much for everybody for joining. My name is Alon Chancer. I'm the VP Sales for Move It. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how COVID changed rider needs and how MAS can answer them. I'll talk a lot about facts and maybe just to start a little bit about Move It. Move It was acquired by Intel. We're an Intel company offering the leading mobility as a service solution. And we are the number one urban mobility application that we launched 8 years ago. We reached a point now that we have more than 900 million users. We're growing very fast, 1 million new users every day. It allows us to collect a lot of data, 6 billion anonymous data points every day, which we aggregate and make us the biggest data repository. We're GDPR compliant, so we don't collect any private data, but it will allow us to understand how people consume mobility services in the city. A little bit more numbers. So we are already operating the Move It application in more than 3,000 cities, more than 100 countries, 45 languages. So pretty much wherever you're going to go and travel in the world, you'll be able to use the application in your own language. We integrated to more than 7,000 transit agencies, more than half of them. We have the real time, so a lot of information, and we'll touch base about the real time later on. We have around 6 million stops, public transportation stops, which again make us the biggest depository for public transportation information. And in the last 4 years, we also integrated all the micromobility, more than 300 of them, as part of our trip plan and our service to our consumers. using the data, and I'll talk a lot about the data. My colleagues were discussing about how COVID impact the public transportation around the world. So part of our data collection, we of course understood that the affecting of COVID-19 was between 40 to 90%, depending on the cities, that was starting to raise after the quarantine. And we see now also some drop after now moving to the second wave. Each city have a little bit different percentage, but we see the same curve. And what we decided to do is to send our community and our users some questionnaires to understand what the impact around it, and even more important, what will make them use again more often the public transportation. So part of the data that we collected is the information about before lockdown. We saw that 66% of the people were using public transportation. After lockdown, it's went down to 37% and then up to 49%. By the way, whoever wants more information about those reports, we're sharing it free of charge, and I'll have a link in my last slide for anyone that require that. And then we started to investigate a little bit more what will encourage people to use the public transportation more often in the US after the lockdown. So we got a lot of information regarding more vehicle, and we see, especially now with the distance, new rules of 2 meters, people want to stay far away from people, and they ask more vehicle. A lot of people were discussing and answering regarding real time. With the COVID, we saw a lot of changes regarding timelines and even the routes of public transportation, and people wanted to get more real-time information, more accurate, and payment, to have less interaction with the bus driver or the cashier and have more contactless payment. So what Movit did, react very fast to that. If before the COVID, public agencies were updating the information, the real time, on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis, we started to engage with the public transportation at the beginning with the real time, helping them to give the information in the fastest way to their consumer using our Movit application. We gave even a software solution that can be implemented in some of the buses that didn't have the real-time communication, and we allow them to use real-time and provide the information to the user in a fast way. On demand, we saw a lot of changes with public transportation providers. Some of them change the fixed route to on demand in order to allow essential workers still to use public transportation, but in a much smarter way. So we saw a lot of projects around the world, and we see a lot of demand for DRT solutions in the UK that we are involved. Contactless mobile. So we see more and more mass solution with fair payment for ticketing, mobile payment. So Movit integrated already to Cubic, Masabi, Token Transit, allowing people in some part of the world to pay through the application. So it's a seamless payment without any interactions with the bus driver or the cashier. And analytics, I think that's one of the most important elements in the COVID and during the COVID for agencies and Department of Transport, looking to understand how COVID changed the user behavior, together with our capabilities to analyze the people movement and the public transportation. So the combination allow us to provide very strong analytic tools to help to mitigate the new changes and implement it in a faster way. So that was just, again, to ramp up or to close some of the topic that we see and the changes we saw in the cities. So the riders would like to get much better information. It's encourage the agencies and the cities to provide more accurate data, increase capacity in order to have less people using the same bus, for instance, or trains. Data-driven, so we see a huge impact of data, allowing the relevant people to understand the current situation, and again, empower riders and keep operation teams safe with mobile payment. And again, as I mentioned, if somebody wants more information regarding the reports, we give it free of charge. You can go into the link and get more information. We'll be happy to share. Thank you very much. And if you have more questions, we'll be happy to answer later on.
Alan, thank you. I think that will generate some questions. And I was quite staggered at the scale you were reporting there. Certainly gave me a couple of thoughts and questions. The last of our speakers, before we move into the Q&A section, James Taylor, could I invite you up? Great.
Hi, Richard.
Good morning, James. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to take you through some of the impact that we've seen through COVID-19, looking first at what we saw during the lockdown itself, what we've seen since, and some of the, I guess, insights that this kind of gives us of what we might see going forward into the future. So like many businesses, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on our operations this year. I think during the first lockdown, car rental was designated an essential service, which was great because obviously that allowed us to continue to operate. But I think the first thing that we had to do was really focus on reassuring our members. Clearly, as we've seen from the previous talks already, there was a significant drop in the use of public transport, and the public were looking for other ways to get around and keep moving for those essential trips during lockdown. So first of all, we had to obviously reassure our members. And we had stringent checks in place to ensure that all our vehicles were cleaned. And we made sure that we increased those cleaning protocols and products, promote additional hygiene and safety practices within the team, and to make sure, just to give that confidence to our members to use our vehicles. We also asked our members to play their part as well, so giving them ideas of things that they could do to help the next user of the vehicle, so such as bringing disinfectant wipes to wipe down the car for themselves and others, keeping their hands clean, hand sanitizer before and after each trip, essentially following the government advice. So these steps were fundamental in reassuring our members that our vehicles were safe to use. We also wanted to make sure we supported those most in need during the lockdown. This included providing vans to food banks and local authorities, and we also introduced a discounted rate for NHS and key workers, allowing them to get to and from work safely. We also expanded our operating area temporarily to cover the area by Nightingale Hospital. The final 2 points on this slide, for me, highlight the positive role that car sharing can play, not just during the pandemic, although this did bring them to the forefront. The first is how car sharing can fill the gaps in the public transport network. Many of the challenges faced by shift and night workers, such as reduced services, were experienced by many during lockdown. Car sharing was able to fulfill that need, providing safe, reliable alternatives for their essential trips. And I think this is something that the sector can build on as and when we come out of the pandemic. Finally, during the first lockdown, I think one of the unintended consequences was the improvement that we experienced in air quality. We all had a glimpse of what our cities could be like with less vehicles on our roads, less congestion and less pollution. And as we think about a green recovery, car sharing can help ensure some of these benefits continue to be realised. So as the more stringent measures of the lockdown were eased in June, what did we experience? Well, in London, whilst use of the tube and buses did increase, it was still significantly below normal levels, with the tube at between 15 to 30% normal passenger numbers and the buses between 30 and 50% over the summer months. Car sharing was able to step up and support our members to continue driving, and we certainly saw a strong summer performance and a growth in membership. And it was clear, because of this, on the back of a reduced availability of public transport and the growth that we saw in the summer months, but there were still some concerns about using public transport. As a result of that, there was an increase in car use, not just car clubs, but car use more generally. And some days, congestion and pollution levels went back to near pre-lockdown levels. A number of measures have been put in place that have already been talked about in earlier sessions to restrict vehicle use, such as the extended operating hours of the congestion charge zone in London, as well as a number of low traffic neighbourhoods that have been introduced. While supportive of these measures, one of the challenges is that car sharing, a more efficient use of the car, is treated in the same way as a private car, when actually by providing greater access to car sharing, we can ensure that people don't decide during this period to buy a private car, which then effectively locks them into those transport habits for the next few years at least. A better approach, in my opinion, would be to recognise the role that car sharing and shared mobility more widely can play in changing transport behaviour, and therefore implement policies which reflect this. I truly believe that car sharing has a vital role to play in supporting a green recovery. So why do I think this, that car sharing can support a green recovery? COMA has shown through its annual survey of car club members the positive impact car sharing can have, helping to remove older, more polluting vehicles from our roads. At Zipcar, we've also set out a vision to be fully electric by 2025. As a first step towards this vision, we introduced 325 electric vehicles into our fleet in 2018. In just over 2 years, they've been driven by over 55,000 members, taking over 500,000 trips and travelling over 3 million EV miles. By providing affordable access to an EV, we're making EVs accessible for all. We also know that joining a car club drives behaviour change. Members drive less and use public transport, cycle and walk more. 23% of our members cycle regularly, as opposed to only 9% of Londoners. And 62% of our members are regular users of the tube, compared to only 37% of Londoners. By providing greater access to a shared vehicle, in the long run will reduce reliance on the private car. And the risks of not doing this? We've already seen an increase in vehicle use post-lockdown. A recent report by TfL showed the number of London residents who had a driving licence but don't currently own a vehicle. With the ongoing nervousness around using public transport, there's a risk that this latent demand could switch to vehicle ownership. So in summary, car sharing has stepped up during the pandemic and continue to do so once the pandemic is behind us. We've invested in and set out a commitment to move to an EV fleet. But to continue this, we need car sharing to be more central to government thinking. We need continued investment in the charging infrastructure with solutions that consider all, so fleets and car sharing, especially the rapid charging network, as well as confidence that the fiscal support in place for EVs, such as grants, will continue. Thank you.
James, thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers. I will now launch one of our polls, which should pop up on your screens, hopefully not too obtrusively, and feel free to answer that as we go along. Can I invite the speakers to turn their video and audio on, and let's move into the Q&A, please. So to get things rolling, a couple of thoughts stirred on my side by what I'm just talking about. James, actually, can I start with you and public transport? Now, we know from COMA research going back through the years that traditionally, very strong link between public transport use and shared transport use. You touched on that in your presentation just now. We also know, of course, that public transport use is a very different beast now in 2020. John, you covered that. So James and anyone else who wants to come in, where does that leave us, do we think? Is this just going to be a different link? What does it mean for shared transport if we're in this world where there's a big scale reduction in public transport use going on for years, perhaps going on permanently?
I think it depends what we do now. I think if there's clearly a risk that people will move, I guess, towards that private vehicle use because of the ongoing concerns around using public transport. But I think if we can show that the alternatives are available, so things like car sharing that give people access to a car when they need it, even during these times where there's probably less public transport available, more concerns around it. I think more promoting that will help and stop people making that change. But I think that's the key challenge, that if people decide to buy a car now, that effectively locks them in that habit and that driving behaviour for the next few years. So they're not going to go back to using public transport when those concerns maybe ease a bit. And so in some respects, car sharing can provide that short-term bridge and shared mobility more generally that kind of keeps people moving and keeps them safe, keeps them able to get around the city, but then can still fill that shared role when public transport starts to take off again.
Thank you. Anyone else like to come in? Matt, I might pick on you actually about, was there anything we could be doing in behavioural design sense that could use some of what James was just talking about?
Yeah, I echo a lot of James's thoughts. I think kind of if you boil behavioural economics down to its foundation, it's that if you want people to do something, make that the easiest option. And if you don't want people to do something, make it the most difficult or more difficult. So it's difficult to see how you can make using public transport easier now, obviously with what's happening. But I guess with other kind of shared mobility options, to kind of make the uptake of those as easy as possible. And I think another principle is salience. I think for many people, this, using shared mobility might be a new thing or a novel thing. So kind of making it as salient as to how people actually do this and what it is as possible.
Super, thank you.
While used to the private car, through low traffic neighbourhoods and other schemes, is kind of being disincentivized as well.
Yes. Anyone else want to come in on this issue?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is the biggest and most successful public transport campaign ever seen in this country. When we first went into lockdown, unfortunately, I was telling people not to use public transport, and we've seen now that it's fallen on the transport operators to try and demonstrate that their services are safe. We've seen reports that tests have been done. There's no evidence of COVID on buses and trains in London, and other locations have done the same sorts of thing. And it's a question of whether, to take the sort of nudge impacts. We've seen Eat Out to Help Out campaign launched. You can have a campaign to actually get people to travel more, to actually go and visit people in this country, to visit the sites in this country. If people are reticent about traveling overseas, especially, here's an opportunity to actually encourage people to go out and do things more actively. And, again, in terms of stopping people doing things, what we were seeing pre-COVID, which is sort of partially ground to halt, but partially continued, is the removal of a lot of public parking spaces. Certainly we've seen this in major European cities, to some extent in UK cities as well. If people can't park, they can't drive. So that's a way of nudging people to use either share mobility, to walk, to cycle more, or to use public transport. So there's small nudges you can do to change people's behaviour still.
Thank you. I like that. Park, you can't drive. Yes, David.
Just to add to that, I think there's as I talked about a little bit, the kind of the system view and what that last mile solution is that connects up into public transport to make public transport easier and more frictionless. But also I think there's a great challenge out there right now to make public transport better. Not only, as John says, in terms of whether there's financial incentives in the short term, but I know we're doing quite a lot of work with the rail industry about taking that step forward in more customer-centric thinking, and how we make the services work better. So I still think there's a great challenge out there for public transport to actually up its game a little bit as well.
Thank you. Alan, anything you wanted to add just for a few times?
Yeah, I think, again, we need to look at it as a more holistic solution. Some of the colleagues were discussing about the first mile, last mile, getting people into a certain hub to use the public transportation. So again, people need to feel safe, to make it easier for them to use the public transportation together with the hailing solution, but it has to be a full flow, make it easier for them and more difficult to use their own car with parking, as other colleagues mentioned. So the carrots in one hand and the stick in the other hand.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. And COMA has been working with other sustainable transport groups on the public transport messaging and trying to get that improved, as we would say anyway, to be more encouraging while still staying safe. Thank you. Those are great points. Let us dive into the chat box in a second. But before we do, the poll I set actually has quite surprised me. So we were asking about the perception of COVID. Has it been an opportunity, or has it only been negative? 21% people saying too soon to tell, which you can certainly understand, but only 5% saying a threat and 72% saying opportunity. So perhaps it's more encouraging than I thought it might be. So lots of great questions coming into the chat box. Let us get started. Several pertaining to rural areas. So I think I'll just ask a broad rural question of all of you, if I can. How does all that you've been talking about, all that we're going to be covering through this conference, how does it flow down, in your view, into rural areas? What could we be doing that we're not, or not doing enough of?
I think, one of the issues we've seen is much more home delivery. And the question is whether you can bring services and activities to rural areas rather than expecting people to travel long distances to their nearest centre. And I think, we need to change the way we think about things. We've moved to a situation where we centralise lots of services. We've built big, massive hospitals and closed down lots of local ones. People are having to travel more for lots of different reasons. If we go back to bringing services back to people, then that helps to both address these concerns of people who don't have mobility for whatever reason, and it also enables people to reduce their requirement to travel by doing that.
It's almost like what's the rural version of, someone mentioned earlier, the kind of 15-minute concept that people are talking about in cities. What's the rural version of that? I think it's quite an interesting concept.
Yes, exactly. Building on that specific question about rural, from Peter Wormington, who wants to aim shared cars in his rural area at those with second cars. And so his question is, how do we do that most effectively? James, I might ask that of you first off.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, from a Zipcar perspective, we are very much an urban solution, but I think there are very different types of models of car sharing, and I think it's finding the right one that fits for the local population. I think price is a good starting point. Often people with a second car are probably not going to use it as frequently, so it's understanding what are those trips that the second car has been used for, and where then can car sharing fill that gap. So the price is often a big driver. We've done some study that you can save around £3,000 a year by switching from a second private car to a shared car. So I think it's understanding those motivations and that behavioural change piece. What are the bits that are going to make people change their habits?
Yes, thank you. Anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think we saw, especially in the UK, a huge shift now in the rural area, more for smart solutions like DRT. Some of them, by the way, with the request, we actually showed with our data also that it's not relevant to put any kind of DRT solution, and it's sometimes going to be even easier to just subsidize taxis because those cars will run anyhow with one passenger. But some places we did show that DRT is the solution to provide still public transportation, but in a smarter way.
Yeah, Alan, thank you. Interesting. What were, if I might follow up on that, what were any of the sort of key criteria or hallmarks of where DRT worked?
So it's really depend on the demand and how the request is split during the day and during the polygon. And again, it's not in a nutshell to explain, but there's a long process around it, how to really define if an area fit to a DRT project. And this is where we're starting before launching a project like that, or before jumping in a lot of cities trying to put a lot of solutions before understanding really the data, the demand, and where people movement. And this is where we're trying to help again before putting a solution.
Interesting. The power of evidence again. Related question from Emma: how do we get people joining our new community share scheme post-COVID? I might come to you first on that. Oh, Matt, can you hear us?
Sorry, I think I didn't quite hear the question because I think someone might have been typing.
So question
Sorry.
From Emma about who's launching a new lift share scheme, but of course in this COVID environment. So how do they get people to use it is her question.
I think firstly people need to know about it and hear about it. And then I think people need to kind of understand what it is and why they should be using it. I think just the kind of general things that you would expect from promoting a new service. I think it's a difficult one to answer without knowing a bit more information. I think the key is always to kind of really understand the context and what you're trying to achieve and what the barriers are and the challenges are and how you can help to overcome the barriers and take advantage of opportunities. But I think if there's a lift share service, then people need to know it's there and have some form of incentive to use it, whether that's actually kind of promotional incentives, whether it's that lift share service is making life easier or better for them, or whether there's some other form of disincentive in that area, whether you're launching the service in an area that's got a new low traffic neighborhood, or there's something else going on contextually. I think you'd want to kind of understand all of those principles and then think about what levers you can pull in both directions. But I think a lot of services exist and most people don't even know they're there. So I know there's a lot of noise. So I think that's kind of a big part of the battle.
Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, Richard, I think certainly when we're looking at designing services around that, I think there's kind of two things really. One is about how do you bring some of those people from the local community in to help you design the scheme and co-create that with you. Secondly, we do a lot of kind of ethnographic research trying to understand how these things fit into people's daily lives. So I think there's a really good place for promoting it through some storytelling about what people are trying to do in their lives and how the scheme can, in the way it's delivered, can help that.
Thank you. Question specifically to Alon from Barbara: is the Move It data for UK locations outside of London? As she says, the transport landscape there is quite different from lots of other UK locations.
So yeah, it's challenging. Again, not just outside of London. In the main cities, it's easier to get the information and the data. When you go more outside of the city, the rural area is more difficult. Not just to get the data, we need the minimum 3% of the population to use our application. We have it in all the main cities in the UK. In the rural area, we need to understand exactly where she would like to get information. Again, we said the devil is in the details, so we need to understand in more details where we need to get the information. In general, we're covering UK as a whole, but again, she's right. In the rural area, it's more difficult.
Thank you. Good question here that I ask myself sometimes. Some European cities and even countries seem to be way ahead in terms of acceptance of shared mobility. How have they done this? Is it simply that we in the UK have been behind in promoting services and schemes? Is there less of a desire to own personal vehicles in those other places? So, question to anyone who wants to jump in on that.
I think it's partly a cultural issue as well. We saw quite a long time ago now, a campaign to try and use, before that people started talking about shared mobility, getting people to share taxis at mainline railway stations. And it was a complete disaster. The take-up of it was extremely low. There seemed to be a reticence of people in the UK. The stereotypical person in the UK doesn't talk to their neighbour when they get on the bus or the train or whatever. And I think there's this sort of people aren't comfortable sharing space with people that they don't know, which is perhaps not the same that happens in other parts of the world. But it's also a generational thing. I think we see younger people are much more willing to share, and that's share space, share data, etc. So I think that's just something that will change over time as generations' attitudes change.
Can I jump in there as well?
Sure.
I think obviously it depends on which country, but I think in a lot of European countries, they're ahead of us generally in terms of promoting walking and cycling, and their physical environments are kind of primed to help people walk and cycle. They've got better infrastructure. You can jump on a train, or you can do multimodal trips much easier. It's already in many countries it's already kind of set up to kind of encourage that behaviour. Whereas many places in the UK it's been built around the car, and things are only just really starting to change. So it's kind of, you will behave in that way in an environment that's been built in that way. Otherwise you're kind of going against the physical nature of the space in which you live.
I think if I can jump in here as well, I think from a car sharing perspective, I'd agree. I think we are behind, and we didn't used to be. Probably the example I always give is Germany, where they've got over 2 million car club members in Germany, and it's rising year on year. And probably about 10 years ago, we had similar levels of members from the UK to Germany. They've been much quicker to adopt new models of car sharing, and so the free floating model, there's been more policy direction from government, from central government. They introduced a car sharing law a few years ago. So I think that all helps just raise the general awareness of different modes of sharing. And more cities, it's not just kind of concentrated in kind of, London is the main market for car sharing, although we have car sharing across the country. But there's a number of cities that have done lots of things to essentially have an open marketplace. So rather than kind of restricting it to one or two operators, they allow lots of different operators to come in different modes and almost let the market decide who will ultimately be successful. And I think some of that more maybe liberal framework to allow innovation and things to come quickly would help us, would see sharing grow quicker and catch up some of our European counterparts.
Thank you. For context, our latest figures are we're about 550,000 car club users in the UK. So very crudely, we're missing 1.5 million, give or take. Any more on this point? Otherwise, I shall move on to next question. I'll just give it a second. It's a question for John, actually. Is there evidence of a shift of spend or activity from city centres to local areas where people are working from home? I.e., in bigger cities, has there been a shift from longer commuting journeys to shorter, much more local ones?
Yeah, so certainly in the cities are very different across the UK. So London has been the most impacted by this, where we've seen a large decrease of a number of people coming into central London, and therefore local spend is not taking place in those sandwich shops and pubs, etc. If you go for the City of London, there are pubs which still haven't opened from the first lockdown. In other cities where they're less dependent on office workers, we've seen more people coming into city centres and town centres because there are other activities there, other jobs there, and so the impacts are not so great. But there's sort of mixed evidence about how spending patterns have changed. What we've seen is a lot more people using supermarkets, and the sort of weekly supermarket shop has come back with less top-ups, with people not going out to their local shops because they're not working as much. But if you look at the data in terms of local sales from large shops and small shops, the sales have changed in the same direction. So if they were selling food, both have seen increases. If you're selling clothes, both have seen decreases. So there hasn't been a move from large shops to small shops, but I think there has been a change into smaller town centres. Some of those have actually done quite well in the sort of commuter towns where people are spending money rather than in some of the big cities.
Thank you. I shall move on to a question from Harriet, which is a question to David direct, but anyone else feel free on this too. Any specific examples you know of where community co-creation of transport services has led to success/high uptake? Yes,
that's a good question. In simple, no. I think for me it's still a fairly emerging area as things maybe change focus in terms of localism. I think there are some examples that we've seen in slightly different areas. I can't think off the top of my head where it was, but I remember there was quite good case studies around using co-creation around retail in some town centres, and how that brought some different kinds of solutions into the local environment. And I think there's also something in there, to James's point about the kind of the market of solutions. I think there's something in there that I'm quite interested in about how the community gets engaged with the kind of degree of choice that can emerge around some of these mobility solutions, and how that helps kind of navigate those choices. Because I think there's a risk with some of this mobility that there are a lot of options, a lot of trials, a lot of choices come onto the market, which become quite difficult to navigate. And I think there's a role for bringing communities into helping navigate some of that and determine some of the use cases that are more sensitive to the local context, I suppose. But it's a good question. I think that for me the time is ripe for perhaps a slightly different approach.
Thank you. Can we just build on that? Alan and James, let's call on you about integration. We've had a question in the chat on this as well. I guess my question is, what does good look like here? What examples have we got in the UK or elsewhere that we could borrow from? And is integration important to you and what you're trying to do, either of you? James, I'll just pick on you, James, first, if I might.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think we're already doing it. I mean, probably not in a formal way, but we know that from the data we've seen from historic surveys that the key thing to drive multimodality is to break the link with the private car, and that's kind of what shared transport does. So our role is very much providing access to a car when somebody needs it, so they can get rid of the private car. And we know that people will walk and cycle and use public transport more as a result of that. We recently, 3 years ago, introduced our one-way service, so our flex service, that again allows for more integration with public transport. So we know that some people will pick up a car for kind of the last 3-4 miles of their journey and pick up the tube during that. There's definitely things to be done across the country that's more of the kind of integrated approach, where there's an app that does all your payment and your ticket in, and you've got all your transport options in there. I think they're still in their trial phase, and we've not necessarily seen that in a wider context, and kind of how you bring all the various operators into that. And I think that's, I think there's still some challenges for me around that, in terms of if you bring all the different operator providers in, how do you kind of control the journey that the member sees, or the user sees as the route? So is it the one that pays the most that gets their option first, rather than what's the best for perhaps the city or the environment, what's the most cost-effective way or the environmentally friendly route to take? And are those kind of options that would come in for the user to choose what's most important to them? And then the question around who owns that data. As a member organisation, it's important that we retain a relationship with our members, and they feel that kind of connection to Zipcar. And is that lost if I go into a mobility as a service external provider? So I think there's still a lot of unknowns, but I think that's where some of the trials that are taking place are really useful to understand, one, how it works from an operator perspective, but also how it works from the user perspective as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I agree on that. I think if until now we saw a lot of companies trying to protect their own data, and consumer trying to push their own application, we see in the last year a shift for more integrated solution. Just look on Uber adding public transportation on their app, becoming a more holistic solution using the Movit API and some others. The same for us. Moveit is a provider that provide the full holistic scope for our consumer, a multimodal. So we're trying to integrate to as many providers as possible and give the best option to the rider without any influences, as my colleague mentioned, depending on the price. So we give the option for the user to choose. And again, we see more and more companies for like ride-hailing, bike, scooters that open for more deep integration. If until now it was more just the deep link, more heavy integration, so you can have one wallet and use it in one application to consume different mobility services.
Thank you, Alan. Anyone else on this integration point? Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I'd only agree. For me, it's, as I said in our talk, it's journeys that we're making. We're just taking steps within that journey, and the more we can link those together, whether it's payment, navigating, and James makes a great point about how we make those choices, on what basis we're making choices about how we link those modes together. If we're trying to we've got luggage with us, or whatever it might be that we're doing in our kind of work, and what's accessible to us, and across all meanings of that, really. So I think that navigating choice piece, and what comes back to us from the providers to help us do that, is a really interesting challenge.
Thank you. Let's pick up one last question from the chat box, and then let us draw to a close. Thoughts on communal car ownership, i.e. 3 or 4 families or groups needing relevant insurance policies as well? Any thoughts on that, Matt or John? I'm sort of particularly thinking of you there, but anyone feel free.
Not sure exactly that the point that they're getting to really on the question. I think obviously the idea of car sharing, we've seen that it reduces the number of cars actually on the road quite dramatically. Once people move to a car sharing scheme, they reduce their use of a vehicle, but that's linked to the sort of marginal cost of actual payment for using that vehicle. And I suppose if you've got a communal car being shared by a group of families, if they are sharing all the fixed costs and making those fixed cost payments, then probably their use of their vehicle is not going to change that much. It's when you move from a sort of having to pay for every single individual trip that you make, then that means you start changing your travel behaviors. And I think that is the big change. If we're trying to nudge people to change behaviors, actually introducing sort of marginal pricing, so they have to pay every time they drive somewhere or use a vehicle, then that has a fundamental change in how people move around and use transport.
I very much agree. Any final thoughts? Otherwise, I shall start drawing us to a close. Hopefully you can see that about the cafe details, so do please carry on the conversation there. Drop in and out of that as you would like to across the whole course of this conference. And I know a number of you have been doing that already. And we also have, of course, further sessions coming up. So hopefully you can see that on your screens. Our next session is today at 2, all about 1 year to go until the UK hosts the UN COP26 conference in Glasgow, of course. And then we have 2 sessions per day running through till Friday. I'd like to take this opportunity to very sincerely thank all my speakers, all their excellent contributions, and all of you for being here, but also asking particularly good questions. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. I think it's got us off to a great start, and I hope we see you in the other sessions. Bye for now.